My name is Füredi. I'm the director of MCC Brussels. I'd like to welcome all of you to this event. When we organized this meeting, we weren't really sure whether it was going to be a funeral or a celebratory occasion. Fortunately, it turned out to be a magnificent day, one of the most exciting days in my life. And one of the things that occurred to me, and this is, I think, a major challenge for all of us, is to try to learn what lessons we can draw out from what happened, how we can apply it, some of those lessons, to what's going on in Europe, in our respective nation states. And I think in particular what I think is really crucially important is that we combine our appreciation of the great job that the Republican Party and Donald Trump has achieved, with an assessment of what is really going on here, what was really important. The main lesson for me, in terms of what happened, is when you look at the election campaign, it became very evident that this was not an election campaign in the ordinary sense. What was at work was not a political party, but a movement. I think that's the big achievement of Donald Trump and of the party, that they managed to create a real living grassroots movement. And it seems to me that one of the things that's missing in Europe amongst the different patriotic groups is their difficulty or lack of willingness to build similar kind of grassroots movements, which they will need if we're ever going to triumph and form governments in the different nation states. But the important point I want to emphasize is that although we're celebrating tonight, bear in mind that the really difficult problems lie ahead. The really difficult problems that are to do with how you govern a big state like the United States, how you cut across the sabotage that's going to be thrown at Trump by the deep state and by the bureaucracies that exist. And the one thing we should always remember, which is, to me, the most important challenge, is although Trump has managed to win the election, and we have the House and we have the Senate, nevertheless, those people who are in charge of American soft power are still there in Hollywood. They're still there on the television channels. They're still in the media. And in many respects, they are the biggest problem that confronts us at present time. So have a good discussion. I'm just here to welcome you. And I hope that this discussion will carry on a long time after today, because the momentous events of today and yesterday are ones that are going to have to be learned, and we have to be able to, in a sense, rise to the occasion ourselves so that we too can make Europe great again, that we too can triumph politically and intellectually and morally, and that we too get out of the woodwork and show ourselves in public and create a movement that can actually call into question the dominant narrative that prevails in Brussels. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is John O'Brien. I'm Head of Communications with MCC Brussels. Welcome to this MCC Brussels event and a live recording of the MCC podcast, Unpacking the American Election. This is where we're going to dive deep into the results of the recent US election and what they reveal about the current political, social, and economic landscape. In this conversation, we'll explore voter trends, the issues that mattered most, and how demographic groups engaged with this election. Beyond the numbers, we'll discuss the broader implications. Did this election signal a path towards increasing political polarization? And what did it tell us about the deepening divisions in American society? What role did social media, independent candidates, and first-time voters play in shaping the outcome? Together, we'll unpack what these results mean, not only for the next administration, but for the future of American democracy itself. So, Donald Trump has sealed a historic victory in the US presidential election and completed his stunning political comeback. the Republican comfortably defeated Democrat Kamala Harris in what polls had suggested incorrectly would be a very tight election, after he swept several key battleground states and won a commanding lead in the national popular vote. He becomes the first former president to return to the White House in more than 130 years. And at 78, he's the oldest man elected to America's highest office. Trump won the overall popular vote nationally, a feat he fell short of when he was first elected in 2016. As expected, Trump has dominated conservative strongholds from Florida to Ohio, while Harris won the liberal states from New York to California. Harris, a woman standing for president, campaigned heavily for abortion rights. Despite all that, she may have underperformed with women. Some 54% of female voters cast their ballots for her, the numbers indicate, but Joe Biden won the support of 57% of women in 2020. Black and Latino voters also appeared slightly less to support Harris than they were back when with Biden 4 years ago. Instead, Trump swept the key battleground states and smashed the Democrats' once vaunted blue wall of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, with Michigan also leaning his way. In what would be a major boost for a Trump presidency, Republicans have won control of the Senate after wresting 2 seats in West Virginia and Ohio from the Democrats and seeing off a competitive challenge in Texas. Neither party seemed to have an overall edge in the House, which Republicans narrowly control. However, control of Congress would allow Trump a relatively easy pass to his key proposals through to legislation, including his pledges to enforce mass deportations of illegal immigrants and to enact sweeping tax cuts. He has also vowed to drastically reshape the federal government, pledging to dismiss thousands of career civil servants and replace them with political appointees. At his rally in Florida, Trump said he had won an unprecedented and powerful mandate to impose his agenda. Tonight, we're joined by a great group of panelists: Dr. Richard Johnson, Senior Lecturer in Politics, Queen Mary University of London, author of US Foreign Policy, Domestic Roots and International Impact. We're also joined by a fellow American, Patrick Egan, publisher and CEO of the Brussels Signal. And finally, Craig Willy, French-American political writer and consultant. Thank you for joining us tonight. MCC Brussels, what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation here for a bit, and then we're going to take it out to you in the audience. At MCC Brussels is a think tank. We were founded 2 years ago. We're relatively new, but we really welcome all opinions, all questions, all considerations. So we're going to be coming out to you, the audience, and I'm going to ask you to carefully think of the questions you want to ask or the points that you want to make, because we want to hear from you. I'm going to start with you, Richard. If you were to tell a story, what happened? What happened in this election? What for you was the story?
Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. This is a remarkable political comeback, and in American history, there's only been one other president who was president, lost the White House, and then returned 4 years later, Grover Cleveland, in the late 19th century. And that was a time when the debates in American politics were over bimetallism, whether the base of US currency should be gold or silver or something else, or the use of paper currency, which might feel a little bit removed from us today, but at the heart of it, this was a discussion about populist economics, in effect. This was also a time when there was a discussion about policy relating to immigration, particularly from China. And this was a time when there was an insurgent populist party. The origin of the American tradition of populism comes from this same time when Grover Cleveland came back to the White House. The other example I was thinking of great political comebacks is Richard Nixon, who was the last nominee to lose an election and then come back and win a presidential election. He lost, of course, against John F. Kennedy in 1960, sat out 64 and came back in 68. But this victory, I think, for Trump is on a greater scale, and the scale of the comeback that Trump has experienced, I think, blows both Grover Cleveland and Richard Nixon out of the water. I mean, I think you have to even go back 2 years ago, after the midterm elections. People were not expecting necessarily that Donald Trump would be the nominee. I mean, there was a lot of discussion after the midterms where the Democrats had done much better than expected, that various Trump-aligned candidates had lost races that they were expected to win in states like Pennsylvania, that they thought that the Trump magic had worn off. His family had walked away from him. Ivanka and Jared were no longer on the scene. His sons were still loyal. There was an expectation that Ron DeSantis could defeat him in the Republican primaries. And then he defeated DeSantis. He defeated Haley. He won the nomination. And he's just won the presidency. And so this is the sort of the narrative arc of this election is one that really doesn't have a parallel in American history. I think the other thing that has given it a sort of sense of added intensity is that although statistically speaking, a Trump victory was always a likely outcome, in the sense that it was almost as likely as a Harris victory if you were looking at the polls. The commentariat had talked themselves into thinking that there was no way that Trump could win. People talked about the Trump ceiling, and they had talked themselves into thinking that he had crashed in the final weeks of the campaign, and that she'd had this strong finish, and it was going to be just a cakewalk. And so I think the commentariat has also caught itself by surprise in a way that they shouldn't have, but they did, and that's why we're seeing some of the emotional response to his victory at this very moment.
Thank you. Patrick, what do you think the story is?
Thanks, John. Thanks for organizing this panel, and it's great to be with all of you. I have to say, I've always found it fascinating the degree to which there is this fascination overseas with U.S. politics. I'm delighted to see so many people here to listen to this conversation or to take part in this conversation. On some level, as an American born and raised, while I've lived here in Europe for a couple of decades, I find it flattering, and I think that it's a statement on an expression of, at some level, the quality of political contests in the United States. And I was reminded of that over the last couple of weeks in particular as I was reading and listening to the commentariat in Europe talk about U.S. elections and the current contest. And reminded of a headline in November 2004, already 20 years ago. Many of you will remember this. November 2004, the day after George W. Bush was reelected president of the United States. And the headline that appeared on the front page of the Daily Mirror was, "How could 52 million people be so stupid?" Right? Some of you remember the comment. And I think, listening to some of the comments we've seen over the last couple of weeks, there is a similar kind of tone to the narrative, commenting particularly on Trump's candidacy, a kind of a wonder at how this particular candidate could still be competitive and, in fact, could win resoundingly as he did yesterday. And I think that particular headline or that particular story that the Daily Mirror running with that illustrated a couple things, and I mentioned that for these reasons. One, I think it's interesting. It illustrates the fascination, the persistent fascination with U.S. politics. But more importantly, two, I find as an American still a persistently poor understanding in Europe among the press and among the commentariat of U.S. voting, of American voters, of who votes and what they vote for. it has been a crazy election. Maybe as we get into the discussion, we can talk about some of the things that that affected the race, because the turns of events over the last 12 months alone have really been extraordinary. Something from fiction rather than otherwise. But we talked a little bit before we sat down here about going back to the question of who is voting and why they're voting, what they're voting for. I think one of the most interesting parts of this story, John, is the fundamental shift in the voting coalitions that we're seeing in the United States. What we're seeing is that the Republican Party is now become the party of the working class. Once upon a time, I would say that up until about 2020, the main dividing factor in among the political parties was income, was class defined as income. And roughly speaking, the Democrat Party liked to describe itself, and to some degree was true, was appeal to a lower income voter, and the Republican Party drew its support from a higher income voter. But by 2020, income no longer dictates the divide. It's really, if you look at the 2020 elections, Biden won among low-income voters by only 8 points, which is significant compared to significantly low compared to previous elections. Whereas among the higher-income voters, the two candidates, Biden and Trump, were evenly split, indicating that the lower-income voters are not necessarily owned by the Democrat Party, and likewise with the higher-income voters. But by 2020, and it's been shifting obviously gradually, but it's certainly more pronounced in 2020 and yesterday. The main division among the electorates has become education. So the real divide is along the lines of education. So a college degree now serves as the dividing politics. And we can go. I hope we'll discuss more of the exit poll data. But it's not only I would say it's not only education, but also the Republican Party and Trump in particular have now begun to win support more among a working class coalition. Certainly the Republican coalition has grown among a working class population and has attracted a more ethnically and racially diverse group of voters. So really non-college voters are now estimated to make up about 60% of the current electorate, and 70% of those are estimated to vote more conservative, more Republican these days. Some real quick exit poll numbers, and exit poll numbers are soft, right? And more accurate or more data will be coming out in the next couple of days. But according to exit polls, Trump took 45% of the Hispanic vote. That's a 13% increase over 2020. Trump won 20% of the black male vote, again, against a candidate who identifies as black, right? 20%, this is a 1% increase over 2020. So a marginal increase, but still 1 in 5 of the black male vote, and it didn't decline or remain stable, it even increased by a small amount. Trump won 54% of the Hispanic male vote, so a majority of Hispanic male vote, which is an 18% increase over 2020. Among Hispanic women, 37% to Trump, which is a 7% increase. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, Trump apparently took 42%, which is a 6% increase. 18 to 29 years old were previously, considered a given in large pluralities or even majorities to vote Democrat. Yeah, go ahead.
Just come to Craig.
Yeah.
Craig, what's your initial takes from what happened?
So I think we have a clear progression, a few stages in this election that also say something about the candidates, say something about Americans and the choice that they had, because I think it's important to emphasize they had a real choice. We often criticize American politics for saying it's a kind of uniparty where you vote for one candidate or the other, you'll get more or less the same package. Here, I think that's really not the case. So the first stage was Trump sticking it out. So despite the losing in 2020, despite or even thanks to the court cases against him, which in some cases seem to have been politically motivated, and in any case made him more popular. So it helped him in the Republican primaries to have these court cases against him. He stuck it out. He beat the other Republican candidates. He had a very clear set of messages about tariffs, which is for American workers, about cheap energy, about mass deportations, which is the flip side of 8 million illegal immigrants estimated to have arrived in the United States under Joe Biden. That's 2 million people per year. It's enormous. And it is a violation of his oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the laws of the United States. And I think that's one of the massive reasons why Trump was able to win, was the Democrats' failure on that. Then we have more on the personalities. So Joe Biden, of course, had a severe cognitive decline over the last 4 years. Already wasn't so sharp 4 years ago, but that was only revealed with the debates, with his, I don't know what word to use. It was an embarrassing performance. It was embarrassing for him. It was embarrassing for the country in some ways. It was embarrassing for everybody who covered up for him. The Democratic Party, Harris, and much of the media covered this up, and it was only with the debate that they realized, absolutely, we cannot let this continue on autopilot. We have to change our horse, and I think that was a wise decision. It showed that the Democrats have some sense. They put Harris, but the basic problems the Democrats have is they don't have a clear narrative of why you should vote for them. Trump had a few simple messages that I mentioned, and Harris could not distinguish herself from her predecessor and was running away from her track record, running away from her comments about banning fracking, running away from the fact that she had been in charge of overseeing border security, running away from the fact that she had said in writing that she wants to have trans-affirming care for illegal immigrants. I mean, you think this is from an SNL sketch, but this is what she wants taxpayers to pay for. And this did not resonate with voters. She was wooden. She ran away from her record. Trump, whatever you think of him, was being Trump. And that was the case when he got shot. That was the case when he donned the McDonald's uniform. And it resonated with people. And I think these are sort of the immediate political trends, but there's also longer-term ones about demographic trends, about an important segment of Silicon Valley coming behind Trump with Elon Musk. And one thing I do want to emphasize, and we have mentioned, so the huge amount of Hispanic support for Trump, which shows a racial depolarization of U.S. politics. Yeah. And I think this is important because so much of the hysteria about Trump is motivated by the fact that they think this is KKK adjacent. This is the white racist coming back again. Absolutely. Look, 52% of Hispanic men, 45% of Hispanics overall. This means something else. This is a multiracial national populism where Americans are saying, we want our government to at least act like they're standing up for us. Act like it. Police the border, defend our jobs, do something. And the Democrats weren't able to deliver that.
Thanks. Because there definitely were issues that really wrong-footed everybody. You have Latinos voting for Trump, in spite of the fact that stopping the illegal immigration, closing the borders, was one of his main talking points. You have a black vote that did not vote as strongly for the Democrats as they did previously, in spite of the fact that we have a woman of color standing for president, and he's been openly accused of being a racist. The black vote did not go in the way that they expected it to go. The women's vote, Kamala definitely invested the Democrats a lot in the abortion issue. We also have a woman standing for president, but the women's vote, again, was down for the Democrats. It also was the case that in states where there was ballots about abortion issues, while people voted for the ballots around abortion issues, that didn't automatically translate into people actually voting for Kamala Harris. So there's a lot of these sort of wrong-footed type of issues. Richard, what were the wrong-footed issues that you noticed, and why did everybody get those issues so wrong?
So I'll pick up on a few of those issues that you raised. So on this question of does a more permissive immigration policy attract Latino voters, I've always thought that this was a flawed assumption. By definition, Latino voters are US citizens in order to vote. And therefore, they are either born in the United States or they have become naturalized US citizens. And we might expect that people who have gone through the process of naturalization in the United States will have a different view on people who have come to the United States, have perhaps not gone through the formal processes, have outstayed a visa or not even come in with a visa, and have not gone through that process. That is a difficult and time-consuming and costly process. And I think it's not a surprise that Latino voters would not necessarily want to have a system that was very permissive of a very open immigration policy. The African-American vote, I think, is interesting here, and I do think we need to be careful about assuming that there's been a similar shift among black voters as there has been among Latino voters. I mean, the exit poll, I think, suggests that Trump won about 12% of the African-American vote, which is similar to what Pew's validated voter survey suggested he won last time. What I think is interesting is that the share of African Americans as a proportion of the overall electorate is down. And what that suggests to me is not necessarily that black voters were switching to Donald Trump, but that black voters were disproportionately staying home. Okay? And so that's also a register of discontent with the Democratic Party, even if it doesn't mean that people are switching, making that full switch from Democrat to Republican. And then on the abortion issue, as you mentioned that, I just want to touch on that one as well. This was an issue that Democrats expected to be the game changer in this election. And they felt that, okay, if the Democrats are going to lose ground with Latino voters, there was some discussion about losing ground with African Americans. There was some expectation of further sliding with non-college whites. We can make it up because degree-holding, particularly female voters, but maybe also their husbands, will vote for Harris because they are upset with the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And yet, if we look at the exit poll, 1 in 3 American voters said that they believe that abortion should be legal in most but not all circumstances. We might expect this to be a group that would break heavily for Harris. And yet Harris only won this group by 3 points. Okay, she got 50% to Trump's 47%. And I think what has happened is that Trump was very effective at signaling his distance from the more extreme or the outlier elements of his party on the abortion issue. And reporters thought this is, he's getting some flack from evangelicals. This is, bad news for Trump earlier in this year when Trump had equivocated even whether he might even have voted. He was thinking about voting for the Florida measure that would have liberalized abortion in Florida. And then he kind of changed his mind on it, but he seemed very muddled on it. But actually, I think signaling that he wasn't someone who actually personally believed in an outright ban on abortion gave voters who believed in abortion in most but not all circumstances that permission structure to vote for Donald Trump. And that actually took the wind out of the Democrats' sails on that issue.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I think that fundamentally the election was about the economy and personal finances. The grocery bill, the utility bill, the how much they're having to pay for rent compared to 4 years ago compared to their real income. And Vice President Harris's challenge was, because it's a change election based on economic issues, it was her challenge to frame herself as a change candidate, therefore completely distance herself from the Biden administration. And then also be able to convince voters that she would be competent on these economic issues. And ultimately, she didn't close the sale, whereas Trump really focused, when he was disciplined on his message, immigration was secondary. The first issue always was about finances and about the so-called pocketbook issues.
Yeah. Greg?
So I would highlight maybe two things. One is how wrong the polls were, and we didn't know before the election how wrong they would be. They were wrong in 2016, they were wrong in 2020, they were wrong in 2022, although 2022 they understated support for the Democrats. So pollsters try to get it right, but it seems like they've not found a methodology that works, at least for Trump. So that's something to bear in mind, I think, in all elections going forward. And a second thing, and this links up to what was just said about abortion, which is that this is about the Supreme Court. So abortion is very controversial. It's a very sensitive issue, understandably so. The reason it has become an issue now is Trump appointed justices who are originalists or textualists, that is to say they try to interpret the Constitution reasonably to its original meaning and not to make things up, found that abortion is not a right protected under the U.S. Constitution. And I think if you read that short document, and it's only 4,400 words long, and it's a very interesting document, I think it is very hard to argue there's a right to abortion in that document. There's the word abortion and the words privacy do not appear in the Constitution, for example. And what that means is now abortion is decided at the state level. So, of course, it does make sense for Democrats to campaign on abortion, but it is not the case that Americans in their states are disempowered. On the contrary, you can vote in your state and decide how it should be. And I think the Supreme Court is a very important institution, and it goes against this democratic idea that Trump is now going to be a dictator. The U.S. Constitution has set up a system of checks and balances. They have a small majority in the Senate, I think 52. We're not sure whether they have the majority in the House. And the fact is, Trump does not own the Supreme Court. He appointed some of the justices there, but really they are people who are committed to a conservative interpretation of the Constitution and not to doing Trump's bidding. I think it's really a disservice to those justices and to really distinguish schools of constitutional thought to say, no, this is just a puppet court and Trump can be a dictator. There's checks and balances. We live in a democracy, and it's very good, I think, that more decisions are made by people locally in the states in general.
One of the keys to Trump's success was this power of a grassroots movement that he formed. It was an unexpected break from the usual orthodox Republican tactics that you'd expect. And we're looking at a campaign, a raft of different constituencies that he managed to form, more focused on the interests of voters than on the identity of voters. And what do you make of this grassroots movement that is MAGA?
Yes, so I guess this is to me, first of all.
Yes.
To me, yeah. So I distinguish this in two ways. So first of all, in terms of the on-the-ground activism in this election, the reporting that I've read suggests that the Democrats did actually have a very extensive, as they called it, ground game. The Democrats had raised a lot more money than the Republicans and were able to invest that on more boots on the ground on election day. And I think one of the things that these elections of the last few cycles have shown us is that just getting people out and knocking on doors is not necessarily sufficient to obtaining victory. That there is a whole online environment now which is becoming more and more significant, and in many ways, actually, the way that you are more likely to reach voters now is through social media and through digital means than knocking on doors or ringing up people in an age when people don't answer their phones and don't answer the door to people they don't know or live in environments where it's even difficult to find someone's front door. So that's just on the kind of practical matter. So then on this kind of on the grassroots, the Trump movement, the MAGA movement. I mean, Trump has benefited from having a core constituency that is very loyal to him, that trusts him, that is willing to see beyond when he might make mistakes or put things in a way that causes pushback against him. And I think that we can't underestimate the importance of that actually for a politician to be able to have that loyal core. Now, that's not to say that these are people who have no thoughts of their own and they just take all of their signals from Donald Trump. But it does mean that when the going gets tough, Trump has a cushion, has a base that he can kind of return to and rebuild in a way in which most politicians don't have that. And when the going gets tough, the foundations fall as well.
Yeah. Patrick, what do you make of MAGA?
I would underline what you've just said. I think two factors in that. If we're talking about something about grassroots, I think one of them is Donald Trump himself, much more so than Kamala Harris, elicits a very, very strong response, both on the positive and the negative side. His detractors have very, very strong criticisms of him, and his supporters are fervently supporting Donald Trump. He's a cult of personality, as you alluded to as well. So he is able to drum up a lot of support. His rallies have large size, large attendance. Fanatic response. If you've ever attended one of those or seen one of those, it's really something to behold. The second part of that, though, is what we alluded to earlier. If we're talking about grassroots, I think the shift in coalition, again, I think is one of the big stories in current U.S. politics, and that the Republican side of U.S. politics has been able to now attract support from working class voters and those who are very, very sensitive to the economic issues. They've been able to broaden their coalition, and that includes voters that Democrats were able to rely on for many cycles, certainly throughout my youth. And they've struggled to replace those voters with a different kind of voter, and have fled to more educationally polarizing cultural issues, which proved to be, I think, divisive among the Democratic voters.
Thank you. Craig, MAGA.
So I think this is actually a very important question for the future, which is not so clear, because so much of MAGA is driven by Trump's personality, which is essentially driven by his appeal on media, reaction, and social media. So will this remain after Trump is gone? I'm not so sure. He has appointed J.D. Vance as his vice president. First candidate and now to be the next vice president of the United States. And that was a signal that he wants MAGA to continue as his legacy in the Republican Party and not fall back on the old coalition, which was essentially religious conservatives, big business, and neoconservatives. I would say that would be the previous trinity. And now they've added the working class into there. And they might continue on those issues of border enforcement and protecting American workers if they see that it pays off electorally. And I think J.D. Vance will want to continue in that direction. And this new element of the tech right, as I say, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Mark Anderson, I think they're going to stick around because they want to be able to innovate. They want to be able to continue to do things in America and not face the kind of stagnation that we have in so much of the rest of the world. But I think it's a really open question. And one of my concerns would be that it fizzles out, because MAGA country, it's often parts of the United States that are hurting. It's less educated parts, sometimes less socially cohesive, and there's a risk that it fizzles out. But I think they are working to make sure that isn't the case.
What's Europe to make of Trump's victory? First of all, as regards the establishment, the political parties in Europe, the EU, Ursula, what are they to make of this victory, and what way will they process it? Second of all, is there any message for Europe? Hell knows no fury like a populist vote scorned. And certainly that was the case in the United States. This is a populist vote. There's populist votes happening in Europe, have been happening over the last period of time, and we can expect more. So what can Europe make of it, both in processing it from the point of view of, now that he's won, how are they going to react to it and manage it? And second of all, is there a message there that be afraid, be very afraid?
Well, I think it's time for Europe to wake up and grow up. And the Trump election is, in some ways, is an opportunity, it could be seen as an opportunity for European states to think about what direction they want to take their country and the direction of Europe on the world stage. What is Europe to stand for? What are the nations of Europe to stand for? Particularly, this is something that in Britain we need to think very seriously about, which is, what is the role of the United Kingdom in the 21st century today? And I think that the Trump presidency will, on a very basic level, will put more pressure on European states to take a look at their defense budgets. But I think also it will make them think about the different alliances that they're forging, their political economies. We in Europe have allowed ourselves to be babied by the United States, perhaps for too long. And so I think this is a moment for potential change. Which direction that goes into is I think, more of an open question. But I think that is the juncture that we are at.
Patrick?
Yeah, three things. The sky is not falling. It's going to be fine. Donald Trump is a very transactional politician domestically, but also internationally. And he's all about asserting U.S. national interest first. So understand what that U.S. national interest is, as interpreted by the Trump administration. You're going to understand which direction they're going. Number two, listen to your voters. Take a hard look at election results in the Netherlands last year, where the economy was the primary issue, particularly housing. Take a look at recent elections at the state level and the European parliamentary level in Germany. Take a look at recent elections in France, and learn some lessons from what's been going on there, and listen to your voters. Number three, significant change is coming to the discussion around the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is going to be a good thing.
Craig, it's interesting that populism, it's been compared to fascism in recent days. People talk about hard right and far right. Populism is about the will of the people. It's also about listening to democratic voters and listening to how voters feel and what they believe in things. We haven't seen a lot of that in Europe in recent days, a respect for a popular vote.
Well, I think that's one of the major lessons of this Trump vote, is to respect your voters. And in many European countries, and this is starting to break down, by the way, because the Trump phenomenon is unique to the United States, but you have similar concerns about immigration, national sovereignty, and well-being, the economy in European countries. And you've had these so-called far-right parties for decades in Europe, for a long time, more so in Europe than anything comparable in the United States. And the default reaction is to simply exclude those people, is to say, your vote is not legitimate, your representatives are not legitimate, you don't exist politically. And this is not going to pay off in the long run. And most often it's done, as you've just mentioned, with references to the Second World War, to fascism, to Nazism, when oftentimes this is a facade. You have French politicians like Lionel Jospin, who's a former senior socialist leader, who said that when in 2002 Jean-Marie Le Pen got to the second round, there was the cry of anti-fascism, and everyone stood up against him, and Jacques Chirac, got 90% of the vote. And he said, it was theater. We knew even back then that his party was not a fascist party. Even back then we knew it. So Marine Le Pen, even less so. So we have to stop with this hysteria, with pseudo-fascism. We need to respect voters, and we need to have discussions. Like, I don't see why the cordon sanitaire exists in every country. I think we should be able to talk with elected representatives, no matter what they are, assuming they don't advocate, violence or tyranny. But they're a normal democratic party, as almost all these parties are. I don't see what the problem is. And we have seen breakthroughs in Italy with Giorgia Meloni, with the Sweden Democrats supporting a government in Sweden, in the Netherlands, as was just mentioned. And I think that's something they need to take into account. The second thing is Europe needs more strategic autonomy. It needs to develop its independent capacity. This is a long-term endeavor. I want to manage expectations on that because it's very hard to get those 27 cats to agree to anything. But there was a good suggestion by Klaus Welle, former, I believe, Secretary General of the European Parliament, who said Giorgia Meloni could be a good person to talk to on behalf of Europe, to talk to Donald Trump to. And I think that's an excellent idea, because I was even racking my own brains about this of how is the EU going to talk to Trump when he wants to raise tariffs, and this kind of institutional, legal, bureaucratic way of doing things is really not his style at all. It really has to be like a heart-to-heart personal rapport. And, Giorgia Meloni could be a good representative, perhaps.
So we're going to come out to the audience in a moment. But before we do, I just want to do a rapid response from you. What is Trump likely to do when you think about immigration, when you think about Ukraine, when you think about tariffs, the economy? What do you think Trump is most likely to do soon?
Well, I'll just take the first one you mentioned, which is immigration. So one of the things that Trump talked about on the election campaign was the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. This is legislation which allows the president to, in a sense, fast track or leapfrog some of the judicial processes that are required to deport someone through normal means if they can be designated by the president as being part of an invading force. Now, this is legislation that has its origins in the 18th century, but it was used in the 20th century, both in the First and the Second World War, including by Franklin Roosevelt. Many of its associations are not particularly pleasant or popular associations, but it was interesting that Trump talked about this in the election. And I think, I think Trump is using it as leverage more than anything else, but he's sort of saying, look, if the legal process is going to make it complicated or difficult for me to pursue these deportations, then I have a legal mechanism to leapfrog it. So I'd look at that. And then just the second thing is, I think Clarence Thomas is going to retire. I think in the next 18 months, he'll be gone. And so I think one of the first battles, not battles, but the first big choices of the Trump presidency will be who does he replace Clarence Thomas with? And he has a healthy Senate majority now. So he could even lose a couple of Republicans and still be able to put someone. So if you were thinking about the previous justices, I take the points about them being serious legal scholars. I don't always agree with their legal interpretation, but I accept that. But they're not MAGA. They don't come out of the movement in the same way. I wonder if Trump will look for someone who comes out of his movement to put on the Supreme Court this time around.
Interesting. Patrick, what can we expect?
On immigration, the emphasis would be on border security and reducing the number of illegal entries to zero or as near zero as possible. I think deportation is a big question mark. I would have my doubts about whether they will go there. On Ukraine, expect some very assertive foreign policy to bring the two parties to the negotiating table. I think the big question on that one is whether he does that with any European partners, whether he can bring some European Union member states or European governments on board to do that together with him to move toward a negotiated solution as quickly as possible. And on tariffs, it's going to be all about those manufacturing entities that are willing to manufacture in the United States and create jobs in the United States. Otherwise, expect more tariffs.
Okay.
I think more border control will happen. There will be legal attempts to get illegal immigrants to leave, for example, by making it impossible to employ them or by cutting off public services to them. There may be major conflicts with blue states over that because you'll have sanctuary cities, you'll have blue states will not cooperate. On the other hand, there's an interesting asset of American federalism, where you see blue states are losing people because they're too expensive, because they don't have jobs, their economies aren't growing. So this is New York, California, Illinois, big states, and red states are growing. So there's this dynamism, this sort of selection of models that work in the American system. So they can have those sanctuary cities. It's not necessarily going to help them in the long term. But I think a lot of less illegal immigrants will come. We saw that in the first term. People just understood, okay, we're not welcome. Like, we have to go in through the front door. We're not allowed to sneak in. I think people will understand that. For tariffs, we will definitely have tariffs of some kind. What level, I think, is harder to say. And then for foreign policy, frankly, I think this is the least predictable for two reasons. One is Trump is not very clear on foreign policy. He doesn't have a coherent foreign policy philosophy. He's often not thought about these things, I think. Probably he has by now, but certainly not when he started in 2016. And also, it's not clear that his State Department, his national security apparatus, that the blob, as was called under Barack Obama, it's not clear that the blob will cooperate with him. I didn't cooperate with him the first time. He has a better shot at it this time because he has the Republican Party behind him. But it still remains to be seen. I mean, Trump is a great showman, but it's maybe not the best day-to-day manager. I think that can be said.
Thank you.